Hey friends, welcome to Embracing Your Season. I'm your host, Paige Klingenpeel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am at the AACC National Conference in Dallas, Texas, and I have another amazing interview for you today. Joining me is Sandy Kirkham. She and her husband, Bill, enjoy a life with their 2 grown children, 2 beautiful granddaughters, and 2 fairly well-behaved dogs. I can totally understand that, Sandy. Sandy continues to use her voice to help victims of clergy abuse. She currently serves on the board of Council Against Child Abuse. Sandy has spoken before the Ohio Senate, a Maryland court, and appeared on a local television show in Boston. Her story, Stolen Innocence, was told in a documentary produced by the Hope of Survivors. Sandy works with survivors conducting victim support conferences. She has participated on panels moderated by SNAP, which stands for Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, sharing her perspective from the non-Catholic point of view. Sandy is also the author of Let Me Pray Upon You. Sandy is one of those people that I had the opportunity to meet while I was at the AACC conference. She's going to talk a little bit about that. But we also want you to know that the content that we're going to be discussing today might be a little hard to listen to, especially if you have littles in the area. So, parental discretion advised. Now, make sure you stay tuned to after the conversation with Sandy because I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my takeaways. So join me now for my conversation with Sandy Kirkham on this edition of Embracing Your Season. Hey friends, we are at the AACC conference in Dallas, Texas. And here's the thing that I love about conferences, and my kids actually joke about this, is I make friends everywhere that I go. So I was in line today, I was getting my lunch, and this beautiful woman said, "You go right ahead of me." And I was like, I want to be friends with this woman. And so actually I passed by her. She was eating lunch with her friend and she had a book that I had just purchased. And I really felt like the Lord said, I want you to get to know this woman. And so I sat down next to her and I said, "Hi, I'm Paige. I would love to hear your story." I mean, how random is that? But this is what the Lord does, is he introduces us to amazing people that have amazing stories of redemption and healing. And I just want to welcome Sandy Kirkham to my show today of Embracing Your Season. Thanks so much for joining me today.
I think you're a delight. I just love the fact that you just walked right up and said, "I'd like to know you."
Right. Isn't that fun how that works out?
Yeah.
But again, I mean, the Lord puts people in our place and we just know we just need to start having a conversation. So I would love the listeners to hear a little bit about your story and where you're at today even.
Okay. Well, my story is one that is not a pleasant one to hear, but one that's necessary. I was sexually abused at the age of 16 by my youth pastor. The abuse lasted for 5 years. It was also physical abuse. It happened in a church that I absolutely loved. I had attended church since I was 8 years old, and I was involved from the moment I could, from camp, VBS, singing in the choir, teaching Sunday school. I tell people if the doors of that church were open, I was there. So it was a place that I absolutely loved. When this new youth pastor was hired, he took advantage of the fact that I was so involved in the church and at such a young age. And he started grooming me by putting me in leadership positions. I was the song leader. He was always telling me how great I was. And of course, I'm flattered. I'm 16 years old. Mm-hmm. He was very charismatic. The church was growing in number under his leadership. But one night after a youth group meeting, he waited for everyone to be gone, and he stopped me in my hallway, caressed my face, and bent down and he kissed me. And the first reaction I had was, what is he doing? I think he just kissed me. But because he was my youth pastor, I just thought, well, he's my pastor. He wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. It was a simple kiss, kind of innocent. And then it progressed after that. I babysat in the evenings while his wife worked, and we were alone a lot, and it continued to progress till one night he eventually had sex with me. And at that point, I couldn't justify it in any way. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know what to do with it. And of course, he's telling me, you can't tell anyone. If you do tell anyone, they're not going to believe you. And if you get in trouble, I'm going to be in trouble. And so I kept a secret. And as the relationship developed, he became more physically aggressive and controlling. He became a different person. He wasn't the same person. He called me stupid, fat, I wasn't good enough. He reminded me that I was no longer a virgin, that no one else would want me. So my self-esteem went completely down. I had no hope in my heart. And I felt guilty. I mean, I knew this was wrong, but I didn't know how to get out of it. And I felt like I was in a black hole. And victims have a hard time believing that they can tell anyone. And so we keep the secret. And that went on for 5 years. till I was 21, and until his actions were discovered by a couple of the elders. He was given a going away party, and I was called in by the elders and told I was to leave the church. And even as I say those words today, I'm devastated because I love that church. It was the only place I knew. And for the first time since I was 8 years old, I was waking up on a Sunday morning with no place to go. Mm-hmm. So I was in a very dark place for about 1.5 to 2 years. And finally, I met my husband, which was my godsend. You know, I knew he was meant to be in my life, but I never told him. I didn't tell him, I didn't tell my friends, because in my mind, I had committed this big sin. I had an affair with a pastor, and I didn't want anybody to know that about me. I was going to go to my grave with no one knowing that about my past until a trigger factor forced me to finally face the fact that really what he had done to me was not right, and that I didn't have an affair with this man. This was someone who took advantage of me in a position of his authority and a spiritual place. So I then started my journey of healing, which was difficult. One of the things that I did was to find an investigator to find him, because I had lost track of him, and confront him. And that was part of my healing. It really was. And I know God was on my shoulder the whole time, because I could not have done it without knowing that this was what I needed to do. I also felt the need to be an advocate for victims, and that was part of my healing as well. Because churches and people in the church don't always understand how this happens, and then what's the best response. Because when he came to our church, he had already had one incident of sexual abuse before he came to our church.
When did you find that out?
Shortly after he arrived, he told me about it. But the elders knew about it, but he said he would never do it again, said he was very sorry, and so no information was given to the congregation, and within 6 months of that, I'm sorry, he was kissing me in my hallway. But he volunteered that information to me. I almost think it was like he was bragging that he got away with it. And at this point, after 5 years, I'm totally under his control. So nothing was surprising me, or I wasn't going to tell anyone. So that pattern of being able to say, I've done it once, I'm going to do it again. He left our church, went to the next church, got her pregnant. Then he went again. He was finally...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. So got another victim pregnant.
Yes.
Oh my.
Yes. And at that point, our denomination removed him. That was a Church of Christ. But then he went to another denomination similar to ours. I found all this out later. And he continued in ministry. When I confronted him, he said he'd been in therapy and he was identified as a sexual addict. And I looked at his supervisor who was sitting there thinking, how do you have a sexual addict as your pastor?
He was in full-time ministry still?
Yes, and he still is to this day.
Oh, wow.
My story has a lot of wow moments to it.
No kidding.
So what I decided at that point, after I confronted him and I realized that he really truly wasn't repentant because he became the victim. I'm sorry because I had an alcoholic father, and people here love me, and I'm afraid that I'm going to lose my church, and please don't do that. And there was never any acknowledgement to me that he understood what exactly he had done to me. And that's what I really wanted. I wanted him to recognize, you took my spiritual life and you contaminated it, you twisted it. And he couldn't comprehend that. He didn't take ownership for that. So my concern was that he was in this church and no one in his church was aware of his background. So I said to him, I feel the need that I need to tell your 11 elders. I'm going to write a letter. He was panicked at that, but I said they should at least be aware. So I wrote a letter. I wasn't vindictive. I just simply said who I was. I said this was something that, he should never have done. It went on for 5 years, da-da-da. Do you want to guess how many responded back? 0.
Really?
So it's kind of like if we ignore her, she might go away.
Sure.
So he continues in ministry, and I feel like, I've done everything I can do, and then God led me to the ministry of the Hope of Survivors, where I volunteer to help other victims and advocate for victims. So it's been a journey, one I hadn't planned to take, but I know God put me on this path. And I tell victims, not everyone has to tell their story to the world. I'm capable of doing that, but you need to tell someone, because keeping those secrets only makes it worse. Right. The whole time for 27 years that I was protecting this secret, he was still a part of me, because I was still remembering that I got to be careful that no one finds out about this. So he was still a part of my life for 27 years. And it affected my marriage in some ways. It affected how I raised my children. They never had a bedtime prayer with their mother. I couldn't do it. I couldn't pray for those 27 years because he would pray with me after having sex. And I would watch him pray on a Sunday morning and preach on a Sunday morning. And that had such a traumatic effect on me because I'm trying to make sense of how this man can say this and do this and then do what he did to me. And so it really is a traumatic thing when you are abused by someone in the church.
Oh, absolutely.
I never blamed God. I
wondered.
I didn't. I never had the feeling that where was God in all this, because I knew that there was free will. I also believe that God wept that night when he saw what he was going to do to me. I believe that. I think, and so I never blamed God, but what it did was my lack of trust in the church. And that's sad for me. Very sad, because it was a place that I loved, and now it's difficult for me at times.
Oh, I can imagine.
And for 27 years, I took my kids because I wanted them to have that experience, but I couldn't engage. And I sang in the choir when I was in high school, and I always enjoyed that. And one day I was in church 27 years later, and I'm singing, and the lady in front of me says, "You have a beautiful voice. Why aren't you singing in the choir?" And I so much wanted to say to her, I can't. I just can't at this point. Now, it's gotten better. This was, I finally have just understood that this healing takes time, and so it's better. And I'm much better going to church. I don't have the same kind of triggers. But I want people to understand what clergy sexual abuse does to an individual. Sexual abuse in itself is horrible, but when you add that dimension of a spiritual leader, it's another dimension that you have to deal with. That is,
absolutely.
If you were sexually abused or someone else, and they can say, well, you can pray about it, you can go to the church, you can talk to your pastor. We don't have those options because prayer and Bible reading are a lot of times triggers for us.
Wow.
So it makes it difficult for us. So I tell people, when you meet a victim of clergy abuse, try to remember that the things that comfort you, like prayer and Bible scripture, may not be a comfort to them. So always ask first, would it be okay if I pray with you? It demonstrates to that victim that you understand that prayer could be difficult. And that's such a relief to get to that point where someone reaches out to you with understanding. Yeah. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And I know that we went through years hearing about the Catholic abuse, and it's only been recently have we heard a whole lot more about the evangelical, and so it is
and the
everywhere.
Baptists there's a huge scandal with the Baptists right now. And it's probably always been that way, but a lot of issues with the evangelical and especially the denomination I grew up in, they're independent churches. So they don't have anyone they have to answer to. So when my abuse occurred, it was those elders who could say, we want to do this or not do that, and we're going to kick her out of the church. And there was no hierarchy to respond. But hierarchy doesn't always protect it, because as a Catholic church, they've probably got the best hierarchy in the world, and they still had failure. So churches, I think, are doing better, because I think we are more aware, like you said, and they're being more, I think, comforting to victims, but they're still not right there with victims yet. They rush us to forgive. Well, God forgives us for our sins. You should forgive him. I have a whole chapter in my book on forgiveness and how that looks to a victim of clergy abuse, or anyone who has trouble. I read a book called, with the title, How Do You Forgive Something You Can't Forget? And that's so true. How do you do that? And I found a way to do it. I did forgive him. Doesn't mean I condone the behavior. Doesn't mean I don't think there should be consequences. I don't think he belongs in ministry. He certainly can be forgiven. He can be given the grace of God, but he deserves it sitting in the third row of the church, not in the pulpit.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and we know, as a clinician, we know that when things happen to such a degree of trauma, we can, without healing, we take that with us in our relationships. And as you indicated, it impacted your marriage, it impacted your parenting. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you first identified and healed so that you can bring some health to your family?
So the first thing that I did when I had this moment, I just thought, I've got to deal with this. But I didn't know what it was exactly, because at this point I still thought I was having this affair with this pastor, that I had an affair. It wasn't until I started reading, I Googled pastor abuse, and I just found a wealth of information, and reading and educating myself really made the difference. It made the clarity of grooming, manipulation, gaslighting, all those things he did to me, I finally realized.
You had words for.
I had words for them. And so I tell victims the first thing you need to do is really educate yourself. Secondly, I tell them, you need to understand, this is so important, it was not your fault. You did nothing wrong. And that seems like simple answers to people who've not been involved in any kind of sexual abuse, but we do blame ourselves. I mean, and questions that we're asked, why didn't you say no? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you tell someone? All of that adds to the guilt that we already have. There is nothing that you could have done as a victim to change what happened to you. You dealt with it with the coping skills that you had at the time. And you were trapped. You were vulnerable in some way, and this predator looked for that vulnerability, drew you in with flattery, grooming, telling you how wonderful you are. You're already insecure in some way, and this person is now telling you how great you are. And then they move to the next stage of manipulation, and the next stage is secrecy and sexual activity. So, you know, a trap is a good trap if you find out you don't know you're being trapped. That's what a good trap is. And what happens when you're in a trap? You can't get out.
Right.
And that's what happens to victims, especially in clergy abuse, because now they've trusted this person.
Absolutely. And here's what is so sad is the place that, as you indicated, the place that should have been the safest. Was actually the worst.
And that's what makes it easier for them, because we've given them an automatic trust. He would take me on hospital visits. He would take me out to lunch. Now, my mom thought this was great. I'm 16. He's a great pastor. Everybody loves him. But if my 30-year-old neighbor had gone to my mom and said, I'd like to take her to lunch, I'd like her to take to the hospital to visit my grandmother, my mother would have looked at him like, I don't think so.
Right, exactly. There would have been a definite line in the sand there.
And you would think, what a weirdo. This guy wants to take her out to lunch. He's 30 years old and married.
Yeah.
But not my pastor, because he's kind. He's helping me. My parents were divorced, so I had that issue. And that's where he tapped into. I mean, he became my father figure, only then to abuse me.
Right.
Using that information, he got into my head and my heart and took advantage of him. And he had the perfect opportunity. He had the perfect opportunity.
Well, I know as a parent, like, this is literally my worst nightmare for my kids, because I know it is so damaging on so many levels. So what is some wisdom that you can share with parents just to protect their kids, to be mindful? Again, as you said, we give credit to pastors because the title validates their role, right? Yes. So what is some encouragement or just resources you can give kids or parents?
So one thing I would say is, again, like if it's not behavior you would trust in a neighbor, then don't trust it because he's your pastor. So if he's a little more hugging, if he's a little more paying more attention to your child than he is to other kids, that's a kind of a red flag. That doesn't mean he's automatically doing anything, but I always tell parents, it's okay to approach that pastor with the idea of not accusatory, but even almost going the opposite direction and saying, I don't think anything's happening here, but it's a little uncomfortable for me to have you be so close to my child. And I appreciate that you're trying to help them, or if gifts are given, a lot of times they start with gifts with small children, just candy or anything. We're very careful about what we allow our children to receive. And again, not in an accusatory way, because if he's not doing anything, he's going to be thankful you brought it up.
Absolutely.
If he is, he's probably going to get defensive. He's going to say, well, why would you accuse me of that? And then he's also going to know you have eyes on him, and he's going to be a little more careful. So that's one thing. The other thing is red flags of, does your child seem uncomfortable around a particular individual? So, if the retreat's coming up and they're saying, well, I don't know if I really want to go. Oh, you love retreats. Why wouldn't you want to go? You need to listen. Why is it they don't want to go on a retreat after all the years they've been so happy to be there? So paying attention to what your child is saying. Watch for symptoms of different behavior, bedwetting, or kind of like retreating into themselves, spending time in their room. And that doesn't always mean they're being abused, but those can be signs. And the last thing I always tell parents, if you've got a gut feeling, go with it. Go with it. You're the parent, and you can pick up the signs a little bit better than anybody else. And it's okay to approach someone and say, I'm not comfortable with you being with so-and-so when you're here or there. It's okay. You're the parent with that child. So those are the things that I try. And again, I would say educate. Understand what grooming looks like, know what manipulation looks like. But these men are very clever, so it's not easy. It's not an easy task. But paying attention's the biggest thing, I think.
Yeah.
And look for resources. The internet's just full of books and things.
Yeah, praise God for that.
Yes. And when this happened to me, we didn't have anything. I mean, there was no one ever would even bring up the topic that a pastor would do something like this. So we are much farther ahead today, and that's a good thing. Yeah. And I appreciate having this podcast and what you're doing, helping parents parent. And there's a lot of things with parenting that I've raised 2 children, but sexual abuse has to be part of that's conversation as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even point out, we're talking about male pastors. Abusers can be females as well.
Absolutely.
But we don't always see that.
No.
And I think that's the other tricky part, right?
It is.
So I know today, or in the past, we used to tell our kids stranger danger. No, now we're teaching our kids tricky people.
Yes.
People that trick us into doing things that we don't need to do.
The other point I would make, if you do want to discuss with your child, if someone you think they're being abused or something's not right, one of the things that we, with the Hope Survivors, and I'm also on the board of Council on Child Abuse, to tell the child good people can do bad things because they're not totally evil people. And most of the time, they still like their abuser in many ways. They're giving them gifts, they're spending time with them. So it's important to let them know just because they're a good person, they can do bad things. So don't let that be a deterrent to telling me if something's going on, because even good people can do some things they shouldn't be doing. You've got to be, you don't want to scare the child and thinking, well, because that abuser has already told him, if you tell anyone, you're going to get me in trouble.
Yeah. Wow.
They've already been set up not to tell. So you've got to be real careful how you approach them. But that's a good way of starting, to talk about how, or the other, I heard about a little girl down the street, or I knew when I was a kid, I had a little friend that someone touched her in the wrong place. Start that conversation away from directing it right to them also helps. That's another
No, that's good.
key.
Yeah. So are there other signs that we should be looking for as parents?
Other than what I mentioned, because again, my parents didn't have a clue. We're very good at hiding and pretending that everything's okay, especially younger children, because they know what has happened is wrong, and they certainly think it's their fault.
Yeah.
So but I would watch for the signs of the predator. How much time is he spending with my child? And is it alone time? And unfortunately, predators go where there are children. That's why we have coaches, teachers that are oftentimes the predators, because they look for those situations. So just being on top of the situation, I think, is the biggest key.
Let's talk a little bit about maybe your child's friend has experienced this, or this is what I have found oftentimes. In fact, I've had situations where I am counseling a child whose presenting issue is depression of their own, and then they share with me, they're in middle school, and they share with me, my friend told me the other day something really weird, and we start discussing it. It turns out, and this was an actual case, where the gym teacher was having a sexual relationship with their friend. And so then I had to go through the whole thing of notifying CPS.
Right.
But this is oftentimes how this happens, is the child's friend tells your child. So how do they navigate that?
Well, that's a new one for me, because that's not an area that I'm probably an expert in. Except that I would say you need to support the child who's gotten this information, because it's probably going to be close to traumatic for them.
Absolutely.
Not as much, but obviously to learn something like that. And they may be judgmental of their friend. And so as a parent, you need to say to them, because here's the thing, when we tell kids, don't let anybody touch you. If it's into your bathing suit part, they're not allowed to touch you. Well, the problem with that line of reasoning is that when someone sexually abuses a child, it happens so quickly, they don't have time to say no. And you're asking a child to say no to an adult that they respect.
Absolutely.
So now
we teach kids respect adults. That's
so
right.
now you've told this child, if anyone touches you, you tell mommy you don't do anything. Well, they feel like, okay, I let him touch me. So now I can't tell because I let him do it, and I'll get in trouble because I let him do it. So that's a problem when we try to prevent them from stopping someone. It's unrealistic expectation to expect a child to say no to an adult who they like, who's been good to them, and so I worry about that kind of conversation going on with a child.
Yeah.
I think the biggest key is this, an understanding of you can always tell me anything. And and to say, if someone touches you there, it's not your fault because it's hard to say no. You can even lay it out to them ahead of time that this is probably what will happen. You're going to not be able to say no to this big adult, and mommy will understand that. Instead of saying, now, if someone touches you, you tell them no. It's not probably...
You are right. I never thought about it like that.
It puts the burden on the child.
Absolutely.
To say no to this adult.
Yep.
And which was partly why I couldn't respond back, because he was my pastor, and I'm thinking, I can't accuse him of something he shouldn't be doing. And I was 16. So it was a 5, 6, 7-year-old. And again, it's someone they like.
Yeah, that's so confusing.
Yeah, it is. So to say, you tell them no, adults have trouble saying no to other adults. If someone asks you to do something, you feel bad, well, I really don't want to do this, but I'm not going to say no.
Yep.
And now we're telling a 7-year-old, you got to say no when they're in this situation.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That is really great wisdom that we could start using, just changing the way that we talk to our kids about it.
How we talk to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's so good. So I want to speak to the people, those listeners right now who may have experienced abuse in their past, but they have not shared that information yet. They don't feel like they're safe to, or they're still confused. Again, as you were talking about, you felt like you had an affair, whereas reality set in later, you realize what really happened. I want you to speak to them. What can they do with that information? Where can they go? How can they heal?
First of all, I do believe that there is hope and healing, that God can transform people, but it's not something that's ever going to go away, and it will only fester as long as you keep it in. There's a saying that says, everything that you bury, you will always carry. And so it's so important to talk about your abuse. And it doesn't have to be it could be to a psychiatrist, it could be to a friend, it could be to anyone that you feel like would respond back to you in a good way. I wouldn't recommend going to the church if it happened in the church, because their response is going to be mixed with, they have to deal with now the pastor and the victim, and that creates a conflict.
If the pastor was...
The abuser.
Yeah, right.
Correct. So first thing I would say is you need to understand it was not your fault. I would go to educate yourself. As I said earlier, learn the things about grooming, manipulation, and see what was actually done to you. This didn't just happen. You were sought out. You didn't have a choice in what was done to you. And tell someone. I waited 27 years before I told anyone. So I understand how hard it is to speak the words, I was sexually abused by my pastor, or I was sexually abused. But once I said those words, it was freeing for me, and it began my journey of healing. I don't know that a victim can heal until they're at least able to say the words, I was sexually abused. So, but the internet is full of books and all kinds of resources. I've written a book. There's another book called Spiritual Abuse by Marie Fortune, and we can put those in the notes, I suppose.
Absolutely. Show notes will be there.
Yes. So that would be my answer to victims. You just need to know it wasn't your fault. Educate yourself. Tell someone. And let yourself heal. Give yourself the right to heal. You deserve that healing, and you deserve to be happy.
Amen. Love that. Well, I think we can close with that word of wisdom. I would love for people to find your book and your information and your organization. Where can they find that information?
I'm a volunteer for the Hope of Survivors Ministry. It's just hopeofsurvivors.org. We do peer counseling, not therapy type counseling, but it's just peer support, basically. My website is my name, which is sandyphillipskirkham.com, so that'll be in the show notes. But
as well, yes.
Yeah. My book is available on Amazon, or it's available through my website. I highly recommend my book for a lot of reasons. And it not only is about the abuse, but how do you heal? How do you forgive? And how does this really happen? I think victims especially would find my book very helpful.
And what was the name of that book
It's
again?
called Let Me Pray Upon You, P-R-E-Y. I scratched out the P-R-A-Y. And so that's the title of my book, and that's what he did. He prayed upon me.
Well, Sandy, it was just fortuitous that we met.
Yes.
I am so glad that we did. And this conversation, as hard as it is, these are the type of conversations we need to have.
We want prevention.
Absolutely.
We want to stop it before it happens. And then if it's happening, we need to stop it before it continues.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
For your boldness in sharing your story. And I know it will encourage a lot of people out there. So thank you.
Well, you've been a delight. I appreciate it.
All right, friends, I know that in hearing the conversation with Sandy, your heart broke just a little bit. It's a reality of the world that we live in. We live in a broken, fallen world. And I don't believe that it was a coincidence that God put on my heart to have a conversation with Sandy, to greet her in the middle of the lunch line and say, I feel like God wants me to hear your story. I feel like God brings people together so that we can hear each other's story, because it is through the testimony of not only the brokenness, but God's goodness that we can see that he is still alive and working. He sees his people that are broken and uses it all to his glory so that we can have the freedom in this world before we go to heaven and live with him. So the conversation, again, can stir some triggering thoughts for you. And so I think the first thing to keep in mind, especially parents, some of the takeaways that I have is just go with your gut. I know Sandy was talking a little bit about how we as parents, as well as having the Holy Spirit within us, can have this intrinsic feeling that something is not right. And it doesn't matter the role or the title of the person that you have that relationship with. I mean, she was talking about it doesn't matter if they're a neighbor, it doesn't matter if they're the uncle, it doesn't matter if they're the pastor. The title does not equate safety. Instead, she's saying, trust your gut, trust what your body and your mind is telling you. And if something seems off, then lean into that. Ask the questions. One of the best things that we can do for our kids is talk to them about how they can talk to us about anything. We want to be a source of peace and safety for them. So even if they need to come and tell us something that is hard, we will receive them well. We will respond, hopefully, with calm and peacefulness so they feel safe in sharing even some of the hard things. And so that leads me to my next takeaway of talk to your kids about how it is hard to say no sometimes. So we know that we teach our kids to respect adults, and adults should be respected. However, sometimes their behavior is contrary to the values that we're trying to teach our kids, and our kids pick up on that and the dissonance that's happening in the way that maybe they're treating the child. Maybe they're treating the child disrespectfully. And so I know that we've put our kids in a hard position in that way, but when we teach them that dissonance, that tension is okay to have and to question whether or not that adult is making wise choices, we want to affirm that. We want our kids to have that critical thinking where they're recognizing that just because they're adult, just because we're required to quote unquote respect them, doesn't mean that their behavior is righteous and okay. So we really have to affirm for our kids that they need to be critical thinkers, yet they still need to respect adults. Obviously, we need to equip our kids to understand that there are some things that they should never allow to happen in a relationship with anyone, that they need to consent to how their body is used. And I'm talking about even just allowing a hug. If your child does not like to hug, maybe the third removed aunt that you only see at Christmas time, then you need to respect that. You need to respect the fact that your child doesn't want to engage in that behavior. So we as parents need to teach our kids that they are allowed to be critical thinkers. They are allowed to say no in how their body is used, and that sometimes it is hard to say no to an adult, that they do have to respect an adult, but it doesn't mean that they have to do everything the adult has required of them. Having those conversations, telling them what they can and can't do in those relationships is going to be key, and giving them language as well as understanding how their bodies are going to respond and act throughout the interactions that they have with adults moving forward. So make sure that you're talking to your kids about some of those things so that they feel safe coming back and talking to you. The last piece, and I really was moved by her statement of saying, what you bury, you carry. Oof, that's a mic drop, friends. What you bury, you carry. As a clinician, obviously, I believe that there is so much value in processing wounds that we have. I'm a big believer in using analogies. And so when I talk to someone about a previous wound, I use the analogy of a wound. And if you've ever cut yourself and you've had it get infected, you know it has to be flushed out in order for it to heal correctly. And that's painful, and that sometimes can take a lot of time to flush that wound. But until you do, it's still going to fester. And sometimes it can get even worse, even causing death. So We have to understand what trauma, what wounds, what hurts are we carrying, and are we allowing them to fester? Once we identify some of those wounds, recognizing who is safe to talk to about it. Maybe it's a counselor, maybe it's a dear friend, or maybe it is a spiritual pastor that you have in your life or a spiritual director. Finding safe people to talk to is key in helping to flush that wound. But keep in mind that God is there with you. He has never left you alone. He has never abandoned you, even in the moment where that wound was formed. So going to Him and asking Him, what can you do to heal some of those things, can be a huge step in getting to a place of freedom. I really want to encourage those out there that maybe you have some of the trauma. Maybe this conversation really did elicit something in you and triggered a reminder of maybe the wounds that you have. Please seek out someone to talk to. I guarantee you that when you find the right person to talk to, that you can feel more strengthened, empowered, and regain the identity and freedom that Jesus wants for you. So friends, I hope that this conversation was both enlightening and encouraging, as well as a little bit of a challenge to have those hard conversations with your kids, as well as maybe with yourself. So friends, I want to thank you so much for listening to the show. If you have any feedback or any guests you would like to see on the show, I would love to hear from you. You can always email me at paigeklingenpeel@gmail.com. We have a lot of exciting interviews coming up, so be sure to tune in again next time for another edition of Embracing Your Season.